Imagine paying thousands of dollars for a first-class seat, only to be treated like you didn't belong there. No warm greeting. No glass of champagne. Not even the basic respect every passenger deserves. Instead, silence, cold stares, and the unspoken message that you don't belong. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was real life. But before I continue, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what Danielle did after landing shook an entire airline to its core, and you're going to want to see how it all unfolded. Danielle Roberts wasn't just another traveler. She wasn't simply a passenger heading to New York for a routine trip. She was a powerhouse, a woman who had built her tech company from the ground up in Atlanta, Georgia, and turned it into a multi-million-dollar empire. She had fought her way through barriers, shattered stereotypes, and climbed a ladder that many said wasn't made for her. Yet here she was, preparing to fly to New York City, where a billion-dollar deal waited on her desk. For Danielle, this flight wasn't about luxury. It wasn't about bragging rights. It was about preparation. Every moment of rest she could get in first class would sharpen her mind for the negotiations ahead. Every ounce of peace she gained on this journey would prepare her for the battle that awaited in the boardroom. But peace was the last thing she would find on this flight. It started before she even boarded. At the TSA checkpoint, the officer looked at her ticket, then at her face, then back at the ticket again. Not once. Not twice. But 3 times, as if the sight of a black woman holding a first-class boarding pass was somehow out of place. At the first-class lounge, the receptionist hesitated before letting her in, scanning her boarding pass once. Then again. Finally forcing a smile that looked anything but genuine. Danielle noticed. She always noticed. But she was used to it. Subtle reminders that society had drawn invisible lines and expected her to stay behind them. Still, she brushed it off. This was nothing new. She was too focused, too determined to let small gestures steal her energy. But what she didn't know was that once she stepped on that plane, those small gestures would grow into something much bigger. Picture the scene. Delta Airlines Flight 422, Atlanta to New York City. First-class passengers boarding, one after another, greeted like royalty. Warm smiles. Handshakes. Flight attendants offering champagne, helping store coats, making them feel at home. And then came Danielle. She walked the jet bridge with confidence. Designer handbag in one hand, briefcase in the other, first-class boarding pass in plain sight. Seat 3. The moment she stepped onto the plane, the air shifted. The flight attendant at the door didn't smile. Didn't offer a greeting. Didn't even look her in the eye. Instead, she looked past Danielle and lit up as she welcomed the white couple behind her with glowing enthusiasm. Danielle hesitated. Was it an oversight? Was the attendant distracted? Maybe she was imagining it. She shook it off and moved to her seat. But as she settled in, it happened again. The same attendant moved down the aisle, offering champagne to the surrounding passengers. Glasses clinked. Polite laughter filled the cabin. But when she reached Danielle's row, she skipped right past her. No words, no offer, no acknowledgement at all. Danielle waited. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe they'd circle back. Minutes passed. Nothing. The passenger across the aisle raised an eyebrow, noticing. Danielle felt her chest tighten. It wasn't just neglect. It was dismissal. A silent declaration that in their eyes, she didn't belong. And deep down, Danielle knew the truth. This wasn't about champagne. It wasn't about service. It was about her presence. Her skin. Her very existence in that first-class cabin. But here's what the attendants didn't know. Danielle Roberts was not a woman who bowed her head and accepted disrespect. She had built her life, her business, and her empire by standing tall in rooms where people tried to make her invisible. This flight might have been designed to humiliate her. But by the time they landed in New York, it would be the airline, not Danielle, that faced humiliation. Because what Danielle was about to do would flip the script, ignite the internet, and force an entire industry to take a hard look at itself. Danielle Roberts wasn't new to racism. She had seen it, felt it, and fought it her entire life. But that didn't make the sting of it any easier when it reared its head, especially here, 30,000 feet in the air, where there was nowhere to escape it. The journey to this moment began long before this flight. Danielle grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, a city scarred by history, where civil rights marches were once met with hoses and dogs. Her parents had raised her on stories of struggle, stories of segregation, of standing tall when the world tried to push them down. Her father, a mechanic who worked 12-hour shifts, often told her, "You'll have to work twice as hard to be seen half as worthy. Don't let that stop you." And she hadn't. Through scholarships, night shifts, and sheer grit, Danielle had made it into Harvard Business School, where she was often the only black woman in her classes. Professors underestimated her. Classmates questioned her place. But she turned their doubt into fuel. Years later, she would launch her tech company in Atlanta, a startup that grew into a juggernaut, employing hundreds, earning millions, and landing her face on the cover of business magazines. On this trip, she wasn't just representing herself. She was carrying the weight of her employees, her family, and every sacrifice she had made to prove she belonged in rooms that weren't built for her. So when she booked her ticket in first class, it wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. She needed the space, the rest, the peace of mind. She had earned it. But on this flight, her presence was treated like an intrusion. By the 20-minute mark in the air, the neglect was impossible to ignore. Passengers all around her had finished their first drinks, some even getting seconds. Their meals were being prepped. Danielle, meanwhile, sat with an untouched tray table, no greeting, no menu, no acknowledgement. The woman seated beside her, a corporate lawyer judging by her files and laptop stickers, glanced at Danielle with sympathy. She finally leaned closer and whispered, "Did they not offer you anything?" Danielle shook her head. Not a word. The lawyer frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "That's odd. They came by twice for me already." Odd wasn't the word Danielle would use. She knew exactly what this was. Minutes later, Danielle raised her hand slightly, signaling to the passing attendant. The young woman in uniform met her eyes for a split second, then looked away and kept walking, pretending she hadn't seen. It wasn't subtle. It was deliberate. The passengers around Danielle noticed. A man in seat 2C stared openly, his brows knitting in disbelief. The corporate lawyer at her side exhaled sharply, muttering, "Unbelievable." Danielle's heart pounded, not out of fear, but from the familiar anger of being disrespected in plain sight. She had faced condescension in boardrooms, been called "Miss" instead of "Ma'am," when she introduced herself as CEO, watched people address her assistants while ignoring her authority. But this was different. This was public. This was humiliating. Her mind raced with choices. She could sit back, endure the disrespect, and let the flight end without confrontation. Or she could take action. Danielle opened her phone and tapped into her notes app, jotting down every detail. The time, the gestures, the skipped service, the silence. Evidence. Receipts. When the attendant passed by again, Danielle straightened in her seat. Her voice was calm but commanding. "Excuse me," she said. The attendant paused reluctantly. "Yes." Danielle locked eyes with her. "I noticed you've been serving drinks and meals to the rest of first class, but not to me. Is there a reason for that?" The air around them tightened. Nearby passengers turned to listen. The corporate lawyer at her side folded her arms, waiting for the answer. The attendant's face flushed slightly. "Oh, we must have overlooked." "Overlooked?" Danielle's tone didn't rise, but her words cut clean. "You walked past me 3 times. You looked directly at me twice. You didn't overlook anything." A hush fell over the cabin. Conversations quieted. The man in 2C leaned forward in his seat. The attendant shifted uncomfortably. "I'll get you a menu right away." But Danielle wasn't done. Her voice, steady and firm, carried through the cabin. "This isn't about a menu. This is about respect. Every other passenger here was greeted. Every other passenger was offered service. I was ignored. And I think we both know why." The words hung in the air like thunder. The silence that followed was deafening. The lawyer beside her murmured, "Good for you." The attendant, face pale now, stammered something about checking with the lead flight attendant and hurried down the aisle. Danielle sat back, her jaw set. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had just said. Speaking truth to power wasn't new to her, but doing it here, in front of strangers, on a plane where eyes and ears could not look away, made the moment explosive. Passengers glanced at one another. Whispers spread across first class. Some nodded quietly in solidarity. Others looked away, unwilling to involve themselves. Danielle didn't care. She hadn't spoken for them. She had spoken for herself. 5 minutes later, the lead flight attendant arrived. A taller woman in her 40s with a clipped tone and practiced smile. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, standing stiffly in the aisle. Danielle didn't hesitate. She looked her dead in the eye. "Yes," she said. "The problem is that I've been treated differently from every other first-class passenger on this flight. And I want to know why." The passengers around her fell silent again, waiting. The lead attendant blinked, her face tightening. She hadn't expected Danielle to confront her so directly. And in that split second, Danielle realized this wasn't just about bad service. It was about something bigger. Because the look in the lead attendant's eyes wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't confusion. It was defensiveness. And that meant the real confrontation was only just beginning. The lead flight attendant stood above Danielle, arms folded across her pressed uniform, eyes scanning the cabin before returning to Danielle's unflinching stare. "Ma'am," the attendant said carefully, as if selecting each word with tweezers, "our crew is doing its best to serve every passenger. If there's been a delay, I apologize." A delay. That's what she was calling it. Danielle leaned forward, her voice calm but razor-sharp. A delay would mean you're running behind. This was targeted neglect. There's a difference. The lawyer beside her nodded slowly, confirming Danielle's words. Other passengers leaned closer to listen. The man in 2C shook his head, muttering under his breath. The lead attendant's jaw tightened. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. Word was spreading. Passengers were watching with the kind of sharp attention usually reserved for in-flight emergencies. Only this wasn't turbulence shaking the cabin. It was truth. And truth made people uncomfortable. Some passengers looked sympathetic. Others, mostly seated toward the front, shifted uneasily, clearly hoping the confrontation would end quickly so their champagne refills wouldn't be interrupted. The lawyer whispered, "You've got half the cabin on your side already." Danielle glanced around and noticed it too. The room had shifted. Her voice wasn't just hers anymore. It carried weight. Witnesses. Receipts. The lead attendant cleared her throat and said, "I'll make sure you're taken care of. But I'll also ask you to lower your tone. We need to maintain a comfortable environment for everyone on board." There was the coded language. Lower your tone. Be less. Stay quiet. Don't disrupt. Danielle's lips curled into the faintest, coldest smile. "I'm speaking at the same volume as you," she replied. "If my words make you uncomfortable, perhaps it's not the volume. Perhaps it's the truth in them." The attendant froze. A ripple spread through the cabin. Small gasps, raised brows, the shifting of weight in leather seats. Danielle had turned the power play back onto her opponent without raising her voice a single notch. Danielle reached for her phone again. Not for notes this time. For her camera. She pressed record, holding it discreetly but clearly angled enough to capture the aisle, the attendant, and herself. "This is Danielle Roberts." She spoke into the lens, her tone deliberate, her diction perfect. "I'm on flight 627, seat 3. I've been deliberately ignored by the crew for the first 30 minutes of this flight. Other passengers have confirmed it. When I addressed the issue, I was asked to lower my tone rather than given a reason. This is how I, a paying first-class passenger, am being treated." Gasps followed. A man 2 rows ahead turned in his seat and whispered, "She's recording." The lead attendant's face flushed. "Ma'am, recording other passengers isn't allowed." Danielle turned the camera toward herself only. "Don't worry. I know the rules. I'm recording me. My words. My experience. My evidence." And then she clicked the phone screen off, sliding it back into her lap. The point had been made. Receipts weren't just notes anymore. They were living, breathing, undeniable. The lead attendant stiffened. "I'll be right back." She walked briskly down the aisle toward the galley. The lawyer leaned over. "You realize she's going to the captain, right?" Danielle gave a small nod. "Let her. I have nothing to hide." Still, her pulse quickened. Captains carried ultimate authority in the air. If this escalated, it could mean anything from a written report to being met by ground security upon landing. And Danielle knew how those encounters could end for people who looked like her. But fear wasn't an option. Not today. While the lead attendant was gone, something remarkable happened. The man in 2C leaned forward, speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I saw it. They walked past you at least 3 times. No drink, no menu. I thought it was strange, but I didn't say anything." Another passenger, a woman in 1D, added softly, "I noticed it too." The lawyer at Danielle's side nodded firmly. "It wasn't an oversight. I've flown enough to know when someone's being singled out." Danielle felt a quiet swell of gratitude. For once, witnesses weren't silent. They weren't pretending not to see. The truth was being spoken aloud by more than just her. And that made the cabin even heavier with tension. Because now, it wasn't just Danielle versus the crew. It was passengers versus perception. 10 minutes later, the lead attendant returned, her face unreadable. Behind her, another figure loomed, a man in uniform with stripes across his shoulders. The captain. The entire cabin straightened instinctively. "Ms. Roberts," the captain began, his voice authoritative but rehearsed. "I understand there's been some sort of issue with the service?" Danielle met his gaze steadily. "Issue isn't the word I'd use. I've been ignored. Singled out. Every other passenger in this cabin was greeted, served, and acknowledged. I was not. And when I raised it, I was told to lower my tone." The captain's eyes flicked to the lead attendant, then back to Danielle. "Our crew works hard to ensure everyone's needs are met. If there was a mistake—" "Captain," Danielle interrupted smoothly, "there was no mistake. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't delay. It was deliberate. And the passengers around me can confirm that." She gestured toward the lawyer, toward the man in 2C, toward the woman in 1D. One by one, they nodded. The captain's jaw flexed. He hadn't expected witnesses. Danielle leaned back, her voice calm but slicing through the cabin. "Do you know what I do for a living, Captain?" He hesitated. "No, ma'am. I own a company. Hundreds of employees. We develop technology used by Fortune 500 firms across the country. I know what accountability looks like. I know what leadership looks like. And I can tell you right now, what's happening here isn't leadership. It's neglect. And it's discrimination." The captain's face hardened, his grip tightening on the seat in front of him. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, others staring outright. Danielle continued, each word deliberate. "I paid for this seat just like everyone else here. I expect the same respect. Nothing more. Nothing less." The lawyer clapped once, softly but firmly. Others followed. A few nods, a few murmured, "That's right." The captain's authority was unraveling in real time. The lead attendant, red-faced now, cut in. "Ms. Roberts, we can certainly resolve this, but if your behavior continues to disrupt the cabin, we may have to take further action." The words landed like a slap. Further action. A phrase Danielle knew all too well. A phrase used to silence, to intimidate, to put people back in their place. Her heart hammered, but her voice didn't waver. "Further action?" she repeated, her tone cold as steel. "Are you threatening to remove me for demanding basic respect?" Silence. The words hung heavy in the pressurized cabin air. The lawyer beside her spoke up, louder this time. "She hasn't raised her voice. She hasn't cursed. She hasn't disrupted anyone. She's simply asking why she was treated differently. That's not a disruption, that's accountability." The man in 2C chimed in. "If anyone's making this cabin uncomfortable, it's your staff, not her." The atmosphere shifted again. The power was tilting. The crew was on the defensive, and Danielle wasn't alone anymore. The captain glanced at the lead attendant, his jaw tight. He leaned closer to her, whispering something only she could hear. Her expression twisted, anger, disbelief, maybe even fear. Then she straightened, turning back toward Danielle. "Ms. Roberts," she said stiffly, her voice taut with forced calm, "after this flight lands, you will need to remain seated until security boards. You will be escorted off for questioning." The cabin froze. Passengers gasped audibly. The lawyer's eyes widened. The man in 2C cursed under his breath. Danielle's blood ran hot, but her face remained composed, unreadable. Because in that moment, she realized something chilling. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. They were preparing to criminalize her existence. And the fight was far from over. The captain's words still echoed in Danielle's mind. "You will be escorted off for questioning." She sat frozen in seat 3A, her back straight, her breathing measured. Outwardly, she radiated calm. Inside, her chest burned like fire pressed against glass. The hum of the engines was steady, almost mocking. The clinking of ice and glasses around her felt louder than thunder. Everyone in first class had heard. Everyone knew. And yet, here she was, made the problem. For the next 20 minutes, the crew avoided her row altogether. The lead attendant kept her distance, whispering in the galley with two others. Occasionally, one would peek toward Danielle, then quickly avert their gaze. The lawyer leaned close. "You good?" Danielle gave the faintest nod. "I've been here before." "Not here," she corrected herself, her voice low but steady, "but situations like this. Where silence is easier than fighting. Where you're expected to swallow humiliation because raising your voice makes you the threat." Her fingers tightened around her phone. The smooth glass surface felt like both a weapon and a lifeline. Evidence. Proof. She thought of her employees back in Atlanta, the young interns who looked up to her, the women of color who saw her as living proof that glass ceilings could be shattered. She thought of the deal waiting in New York, the one that would put her company on the map globally. And then she thought of her grandmother. Danielle's grandmother, Evelyn, had been a civil rights activist in the 1960s. She used to tell stories of being denied seats at diners, of police dogs snarling on sidewalks, of sitting in silence while white students mocked her at school. "Baby," Evelyn once told her, "they'll always try to write you out of the story. You've got to be the one holding the pen." Danielle could almost hear her voice now, echoing across decades, a reminder that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every black traveler who had been side-eyed at a boarding gate. Every woman who had been asked to calm down when all she demanded was equality. Tears threatened at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of them. Her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced down. It was a text from her assistant, sent before takeoff. "You got this. The boardroom's yours." Danielle exhaled slowly, steadying herself. This wasn't going to break her. This wasn't going to derail her deal, her dignity, her resolve. They wanted her small. They wanted her invisible. Instead, she was going to be unforgettable. Her thoughts drifted inward, a battle raging between fear and defiance. What if security really does drag me off? What if this goes viral and investors see me as a liability? What if my company suffers because of this fight? But then came the counter voice, sharp and steady. What if silence costs me more than speaking? What if my employees see this and realize they don't have to endure it quietly? What if my stand forces change, not just for me, but for everyone who looks like me? The war within her heart began to settle. Not because the fear was gone, but because the purpose was bigger than the fear. Passengers whispered across the aisle. Some glanced back at her with sympathy. Others avoided her eyes, unwilling to take a side. The divide in the cabin was as clear as the invisible line drawn between rows of privilege. The man in 2C leaned forward again. "You know, I think they're panicking. That's why they're threatening security. They know they messed up. They just don't want to admit it." Danielle tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing on the galley where the crew lingered. Then they're about to learn the cost of doubling down. She took out her phone once more, not to record, but to write. Her fingers tapped furiously on the Notes app. Ignored during boarding. No greeting, no champagne, no acknowledgement. Told to lower my tone when I addressed it. Captain deflected, refused to acknowledge discrimination. Threatened with security escort upon landing. Witnesses confirmed neglect. Her list grew longer with every remembered slight. With every bullet point, her resolve hardened. This wouldn't be brushed under the carpet. Not this time. The lead attendant returned, her posture stiff, her face forced into neutrality. She stopped at Danielle's row. "Ms. Roberts," she said, "the captain has decided that in order to ensure a safe and comfortable landing, we will not be serving you for the remainder of the flight." The cabin went silent. No meal. No drink. Nothing. Danielle blinked once, her expression unreadable. "So you're doubling down? You're refusing service entirely?" The attendant's jaw flexed. "That's correct." The lawyer beside her muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." The man in 2C spoke louder this time. "That's discrimination in plain sight." Passengers murmured. The tension was thick, electric. The crew wasn't just ignoring Danielle anymore. They were isolating her. Danielle's chest rose and fell slowly. She looked down at her hands, at the phone glowing faintly in her palm. And then she realized, this wasn't humiliation anymore. It was strategy. They thought stripping her of service would strip her of dignity. They thought silencing her would protect their comfort. They thought threatening her with security would end the story. But they were wrong. Because this story wasn't ending. It was beginning. Danielle lifted her head, locking eyes with the lead attendant. "I hope you understand," she said softly, every syllable dripping with quiet conviction, "that when we land, you won't just be dealing with me. You'll be dealing with everyone who's ever experienced this and stayed silent." "I don't stay silent." The attendant swallowed hard, her mask of professionalism cracking for just a second. The cabin was watching, waiting. And then the intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're beginning our initial descent into New York. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." Danielle leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed forward, her jaw set like stone. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. Because the real confrontation was waiting on the ground. The descent into New York airspace was smooth, but inside the cabin, the air was jagged. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, watching Danielle, watching the crew, watching the tension thicken like a storm pressing against the fuselage. The captain's voice filled the speakers again. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing." The lead attendant's heels clicked down the aisle. She stopped abruptly at Danielle's row, her smile tight and unconvincing. "Ms. Roberts," she said, her voice like glass under pressure, "when we land, please remain in your seat. Security will be boarding to escort you." Danielle looked her straight in the eye. "I'll remain seated. But when security comes, I won't be the one on trial." "You will." The attendant's nostrils flared, and she walked briskly away. The lawyer whispered, "You've got them rattled." Danielle didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed forward, unblinking. Every cell in her body was bracing for impact, not of the wheels on the runway, but of the confrontation waiting just beyond the gate. The wheels screeched against the JFK tarmac, a sharp reminder that the fight had only just begun. The engines roared, brakes pressed, and the cabin jolted forward. Applause broke out, a customary reaction to safe landings, but in first class, it sounded hollow. No smiles. No relief. Just anticipation. As the plane taxied to the gate, Danielle's phone buzzed in her lap. She unlocked it discreetly. Dozens of messages poured in from her assistant, her team, and even investors. Somehow, her live note-taking and partial recording had already been shared. She glanced at her notifications, hashtags forming, people retweeting, comments pouring in. The story was already spreading, and she hadn't even stepped off the plane. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just her fight anymore. The world was watching. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "welcome to New York. For your safety, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." The chime sounded. Passengers reached for bags. The hum of shuffling belongings filled the cabin. But Danielle remained still, her seatbelt still locked. So did the lawyer beside her. So did the man in 2C. So did the woman in 1D. A quiet rebellion. The lead attendant glanced back, lips pressed thin. She knew the support Danielle had gathered wasn't going to fade. And then, the cabin door clicked open. 2 security officers entered, uniformed, broad-shouldered, expressions unreadable. Their radios crackled softly as they stepped into first class. "Ms. Roberts?" one asked firmly. "Yes," Danielle said, her voice steady. "Please remain seated while we discuss a situation that was reported during the flight." Danielle raised a brow. "Reported? By whom?" One officer shifted uncomfortably. "By the flight crew." The lawyer cut in. "Then you'll also be taking statements from the passengers who witnessed everything." "Correct." The officers glanced at one another, clearly unprepared for resistance. The lead attendant moved closer, her voice rising in false authority. "Officers, this passenger disrupted service, made the crew uncomfortable, and refused to cooperate when asked." Danielle's chest tightened, but her voice remained calm. "That's a lie," she said firmly. "I asked why I was being ignored. I documented everything. I have witnesses." The lawyer added, "And if you're going to question her, you'll be questioning me too. Because I saw the entire thing." The man in 2C stood halfway up. "So did I." The woman in 1D raised her hand. "Me too." The lead attendant faltered. She hadn't expected solidarity. One officer held up his hand. "All right, let's slow this down. Ms. Roberts, if you'll come with us off the aircraft, we can resolve this." Danielle tilted her head. "Why me? Why not the crew who ignored me? Why not the person who lied just now to your faces?" Passengers murmured again. The atmosphere was suffocating. The lawyer leaned forward. "If you take her without hearing witnesses, you're complicit. You're part of the problem." The officers shifted again, visibly uncomfortable. They were caught between procedure and principle. Finally, Danielle unbuckled her seatbelt. The click was louder than it should have been, slicing through the silence. She rose to her feet slowly, every motion deliberate, her posture regal. "If we're doing this," she said, her voice carrying through the cabin, "we're doing it in the open. I won't be escorted like a criminal. Not when I've done nothing wrong." She stepped into the aisle, her shoulders squared. Passengers' eyes followed her every move. Some recorded discreetly on their phones. The officers stepped aside slightly, unsure whether to lead or follow. The lead attendant looked as if she'd swallowed fire. Danielle walked forward, heels clicking against the narrow aisle floor. The lawyer rose and followed. Then, shockingly, the man in 2C stood and stepped into the aisle as well. "I'll be a witness," he said. The woman in 1D followed. "Me too." A ripple of motion spread through the cabin. One by one, passengers nodded, murmured support, or lifted their phones higher. This wasn't just Danielle walking down the aisle. It was a procession. A movement in miniature. The officers led her toward the open cabin door, but the optics had already flipped. It didn't look like they were escorting a disruptive passenger. It looked like they were walking alongside a leader with a crowd at her back. The jet bridge was cold and sterile. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Danielle stepped into the open space, her entourage behind her. 3 more security personnel waited near the gate desk. One of them held a clipboard, pen poised. "Ms. Roberts," he said briskly, "we'll need to take your statement." Danielle raised her chin. "But, because I'll also be taking names." She gestured back toward the plane. "And every passenger willing to speak will be giving their statements too. I won't be isolated. Not this time." The lawyer nodded firmly at her side. "We'll also need your badge numbers." The lead attendant finally stepped off the plane, her face flushed. "This is unnecessary. She created a scene on board. She's exaggerating." "Exaggerating?" Danielle cut in, her voice sharp enough to draw stares from waiting passengers in the terminal. "Every second of it is documented. Every witness is right here." The officer with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably. The power dynamic had shifted again. The lead attendant's composure cracked. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with rage now. "You're making a mistake, Ms. Roberts. People like you." The words slipped out before she could catch them. The entire jet bridge went silent. Danielle's eyes narrowed. "People like me?" she repeated, her voice low, dangerous, every syllable laced with steel. The passengers behind her gasped audibly. The lawyer's jaw dropped. Even the officers froze. Because in that instant, the mask was gone. The truth stood naked in the fluorescent light. And Danielle was no longer just defending herself. She was about to expose the entire airline. The words, "people like you," hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one breathed. For a heartbeat, the entire jet bridge was a stage, and the lead attendant had delivered the line that revealed everything. Danielle's eyes locked on her voice cutting sharp as glass. "Say that again." The attendant's lips trembled. She tried to backtrack. I didn't mean." But it was too late. Phones were up, cameras rolling, passengers whispering loudly enough for it to be heard. And Danielle knew. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the times someone else hadn't been recorded. Passengers exiting the plane lingered near the gate, whispering, filming, posting. The energy was shifting from quiet murmurs to buzzing outrage. A woman in her 30s, still holding her carry-on, spoke loudly. "I heard everything." She said it. "Don't let them twist it." The lawyer stepped forward, pointing at the officers. "You just heard her. And you have multiple witnesses. Are you still going to pretend this is procedure? Or are you going to document a hate incident for what it is?" The officers stiffened. They weren't trained for this kind of spectacle, with cameras, witnesses, and a growing crowd. Danielle, still calm, pulled her phone from her bag. Without breaking eye contact with the attendant, she hit record. "Since they want to distort the truth," she said, her voice projecting like she was speaking at a rally, "let's document it ourselves. Right here, right now." She held her phone steady, her voice unwavering. "My name is Danielle Roberts. I am an American businesswoman returning from a trip overseas. On this flight, I was repeatedly ignored by the crew. When I asked why, I was dismissed. When I pressed for answers, I was threatened with security. And just now, in front of witnesses, this flight attendant made a racist remark. "People like you." The crowd gasped again. Some nodded, murmuring agreement. Others whispered, "It's true. We heard it." The lead attendant reached out. "Stop recording. You can't film me without consent." Danielle tilted the camera closer. "Funny how you had no problem parading me as a threat. Now that the truth is being documented, you're afraid." Her lawyer leaned close. "Post it. Right now. Don't wait." Danielle's thumb hovered for only a moment before pressing upload. Her phone screen lit up with the spinning wheel of connection, then, posted. Within seconds, likes appeared. Shares multiplied. Comments began pouring in. The fire had been lit. As the situation spiraled, a man in a navy suit approached quickly, ID badge gleaming. The airline operations manager. "Ms. Roberts," he began smoothly, "let's step aside and discuss this matter privately. We don't need a spectacle in front of other passengers." Danielle turned the camera on him. "Privately?" Because what happened wasn't private. It happened in the open, in front of everyone here. And now the world deserves to see how your airline handles it." The passengers applauded softly. A ripple of support that carried weight. The manager's jaw tightened. "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this." Danielle cut him off. "Escalate it? Please. Go ahead. Let's see how escalation looks when millions of people are watching live." She flipped the live stream button. Her phone now broadcasted everything in real time. Within minutes, notifications exploded. Hashtag flying while black trended. Hashtag justice for Danielle appeared. Clips spread across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, her calm, steady voice paired with the attendant's trembling denial. Comment sections filled with outrage. "This is why we record everything." Imagine how many times this has happened without proof. Tag the airline. They don't get to hide. Danielle's follower count skyrocketed by the thousands as she stood there in the terminal, phone raised, documenting every second. The suited manager stepped aside to take a frantic phone call. His face turned pale as he listened. He returned, his tone suddenly gentler. "Ms. Roberts, corporate will be issuing an apology. We'd like to offer you compensation for the experience." Danielle's laugh was sharp, slicing through his rehearsed diplomacy. Compensation? A free flight? Miles? Do you think this is about my comfort? This is about your culture. Your system. Your silence. No voucher will cover what just happened. The crowd erupted in agreement. People clapped. Some shouted, "Tell them." The manager's composure cracked. He whispered to the attendant, but it was too late. She looked like she wanted to vanish. The noise drew attention. Reporters who had been waiting at nearby gates for unrelated stories rushed toward the scene, cameras ready. "Ms. Roberts, can you give us a statement? What happened on that flight?" Danielle didn't flinch. She faced the cameras with the same steadiness she had in the cabin. "What happened is what happens every day to people who look like me, but this time, it was caught. This time, it can't be denied." Flashes went off. Microphones stretched closer. Passengers behind her raised their hands. "We saw it. We'll testify." The lawyer whispered urgently, "This is becoming national news, right now." Within an hour, the airline's official Twitter posted a bland statement. "We are aware of an incident involving a passenger and crew member on Flight 227. We are conducting a full review." The comments exploded instantly. Conducting a review? The video is already everywhere. Say her name. Say Danielle Roberts. Fire that attendant. Or we'll boycott. The statement only fueled the fire. Every delay, every vague word, every attempt to downplay it became gasoline on a growing inferno. Danielle turned to the cameras, her live stream still rolling. "This is bigger than me. This is about accountability. If the airline wants to show they care about equity, then let them prove it publicly. Not in emails. Not in private meetings. Now." The lawyer handed her a printed document, something they had drafted quickly on a laptop during the flight's final hour. A formal public demand for action, termination of the attendant, mandatory bias training for staff, transparency reports. Danielle held it up to the cameras. "This is our demand. And if they don't respond, this doesn't stop here." Her words ricocheted across the internet. Clips were reposted by influencers, activists, and celebrities. News outlets picked it up within hours. Anchors spoke her name. Talk shows debated it. Hashtags crossed borders. This wasn't just about one airline. It was about every hidden moment of racism in transit, now forced into daylight. Back in the terminal, the suited manager returned, visibly sweating now. He spoke quickly, almost pleading. "Ms. Roberts, corporate is prepared to meet with you immediately. The CEO himself wants to call." Danielle raised her phone higher, the live stream catching every word. "Tell him he can meet me here, in the open, with these passengers as witnesses. Because if he thinks I'll be silenced behind closed doors, he's mistaken." Gasps rippled again. The crowd erupted in cheers. The manager's face flushed. He looked like he might snap, but he didn't dare. Too many eyes. Too many phones. And then, from the corner of the terminal, another figure appeared. A woman in a sharp gray blazer, flanked by two assistants, walking briskly. The vice president of customer experience for the airline. She didn't wait for introductions. She walked straight up to Danielle, cameras flashing, live stream rolling. "Ms. Roberts," she said firmly, her tone rehearsed but strained, "on behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for the events you've described." Danielle tilted her head, eyes narrowing. Apologize? Or admit the truth? The VP hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But the pause was enough. Cameras zoomed in. Live streams froze on her silence. Danielle leaned closer, her voice carrying across the terminal. "Because until you admit what this is, racism, your apology means nothing." The terminal went dead quiet. Reporters leaned forward. Phones stayed locked on the scene. The VP's lips parted as though to speak. And then she froze, every eye in the airport waiting for the word. The vice president's lips parted, but no word came out. Phones were still raised, the live stream rolling. The passengers, the press, waited for the word she refused to say. Racism. But she didn't. She shifted, her corporate smile cracking under the pressure. Cameras captured every blink, every twitch. And that silence became the loudest sound in the room. Within hours, the silence itself became a meme. Clips of the VP's hesitations spread across platforms. Hashtags evolved. Hashtag say the word. Hashtag flying while black. Hashtag justice for Danielle. Celebrities weighed in. A-list actors tweeted support. Athletes reposted Danielle's video. Activists demanded accountability. Even politicians chimed in, their words turning the story into a nationwide debate. Cable news rolled the footage on repeat. The hesitation seen around the world, one anchor called it. That night, standing in a hotel room lit by ring lights and a laptop camera, Danielle went live again. Her voice was calm, but it carried weight. This is not just about me. This is about how countless people are treated every day when they don't have the privilege of a camera or a platform. We are no longer accepting silence. We demand recognition. We demand accountability. The live chat flooded with fire emojis, hearts, and words of solidarity. Thousands pledged to boycott the airline until action was taken. By morning, the airline CEO released a video statement. He sat behind a polished desk, the company logo behind him. His tone was rehearsed, corporate, almost robotic. We regret the experience of our valued passenger, Ms. Roberts. We do not tolerate discrimination. We are investigating the matter fully. The reaction was instant and brutal. Investigating? The video is right there. This isn't regret. This is damage control. Say the word racism. The comment section buried the video in anger. News outlets reported shareholder panic. The airline's stock dropped 6% in a single day. Activist groups launched petitions demanding firings, reforms, and federal investigations. Airline employees began leaking internal memos, revealing years of ignored complaints about bias and discrimination. Suddenly, this wasn't just one incident. It was a pattern, and Danielle was now the face of it. In London, protesters gathered outside the airline's UK headquarters holding signs. Flying while black is not a crime. Say the word. In Paris, activists marched at Charles de Gaulle Airport. In Johannesburg, radio hosts covered Danielle's story like it was breaking news. This wasn't just an American issue anymore. It had gone global. Inside airline headquarters, executives were in chaos. Emails leaked to the press showed frantic damage control. Some pushed for firing the attendant immediately. Others worried it would be seen as scapegoating. But every hour of indecision was costing millions in PR disaster. Danielle's lawyer received 3 calls from the airline's legal team in one afternoon, each more desperate than the last. Ms. Roberts, what will it take to resolve this privately? Danielle's response was firm, public, and simple. There is no private resolution. Accountability must be public. By day 3, mainstream news headlines blared. Will the airline say the word? Danielle Roberts sparks nationwide boycott. Airline's silence equals complicity? And still, the airline refused to say it. That word. The truth. Racism. Senators demanded hearings. The Department of Transportation announced a review of bias complaints against airlines. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Danielle, inviting her to speak on national stages. She accepted not as a victim, but as a leader. This is about dignity, about fairness, about ending the silence. On day 5, the airline announced an emergency press conference in New York City. The CEO himself would address the world. The ballroom filled with reporters, flashing cameras, live streams from every angle. The stage bore the airline's logo like a shield. And then, gasps swept the room. Because seated in the front row, flanked by her lawyer and allies, was Danielle Roberts herself. Every camera turned. The CEO walked onto the stage, adjusted his tie, and leaned toward the microphone. He looked directly at Danielle, then at the sea of cameras. His lips parted. Ladies and gentlemen, today, I want to address what happened as what it truly is. He paused. The words sat heavy on the tip of his tongue. The world leaned in, waiting. Would he finally say it? Would he speak the word his airline had avoided? Danielle's eyes narrowed. The cameras zoomed. The room fell silent. And just as the first syllable formed on his lips, the live stream cut to black. The live stream had cut to black, but within minutes, alternate angles began surfacing. Passengers and reporters in the room had kept recording. Clips uploaded to Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube showed the missing moment. The airline CEO leaned into the microphone, looking directly at Danielle. His voice shook, not with anger, but with the weight of inevitability. What happened to Ms. Roberts was not just poor service. It was not a misunderstanding. It was racism. And for that, we take full responsibility. The word finally dropped. Racism. The room erupted, half in gasps, half in applause. Danielle sat still, her face unreadable, but her eyes shone with a restrained fire. The declaration sent shockwaves across the media. Headlines screamed, "Airline CEO admits racism in historic statement." Danielle Roberts forces industry reckoning. Stock prices dipped again, but activists called it a victory. Protest leaders celebrated, "This is proof that pressure works." The flight attendant was placed on leave, pending investigation. The airline pledged to roll out nationwide diversity and bias training. But Danielle wasn't celebrating, not yet. When approached for comment, Danielle's answer was measured. This was never about an apology. It was about truth. And the truth was finally spoken. But this is only step one. If real change doesn't follow, then those words are empty. Her words became another rallying cry. Protesters outside airline offices held up posters. Step 2, action. In the weeks that followed, other passengers across the world shared their own stories of discrimination while flying. Hashtags spread across multiple languages. International airlines issued their own statements, terrified of being the next to fall under fire. Danielle's single confrontation had sparked a global reckoning. Invitations poured in, for interviews, keynote speeches, panels on racial justice. She was no longer just Danielle Roberts, the CEO who had been ignored in first class. She was now Danielle Roberts, the woman who forced the airline industry to confront its silence. But she never let the spotlight erase the heart of the matter. "This isn't my story alone," she said in a national interview. "This is the story of every person who has ever been dismissed, silenced, or ignored. If my platform can force even one institution to change, then I'll use it every single day." Months later, the airline reported sweeping reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. A new diversity board with outside accountability partners. Public reporting on discrimination complaints. It wasn't perfect. Critics said it was too little, too late. But one thing was undeniable. Without Danielle's stand, none of it would have happened. Late one evening, after a long day of interviews and meetings, Danielle sat alone by her office window, city lights stretching into the horizon. She thought back to that first-class cabin. The cold stares. The silence. The humiliation. And then she thought of what followed. The voices that joined hers, the millions who refused to let the story die, the movement that bloomed from a single spark. She smiled faintly. Not a smile of triumph, but of purpose. The story of Danielle Roberts isn't just about racism on one flight. It's about what happens when silence is broken, when truth is spoken, when injustice is dragged into the light. It's about the power of one voice, and the millions who can echo it. Because sometimes, the difference between silence and change is a single person refusing to be ignored. If Danielle's courage moved you, if her fight for dignity and justice reminded you of why our voices matter, then don't let this be just another video you watch. Be part of this movement. Hit subscribe right now, turn on the notification bell, and join a community that refuses to stay silent. Together, we can take stories like Danielle's and push them into the world until real change happens. One voice can spark it. A million voices can finish it. Will you be one of them?